What's up, YouTube? My name's Christian, and this is a video for anyone who's been considering switching to Linux but hasn't taken the dive yet. I'm going to try to convince you why you should take that chance. This video is aimed at the person who's more security conscious, so maybe someone that doesn't like Microsoft and their relentless inclusion of AI features and surveillance. Useful AI features like Recall, which basically saves local snapshots of everything you're doing on your computer at any given moment, so you can easily recall them with conversations with Copilot AI. Someone like me, I hear that news and I just want to immediately get off Windows. And luckily I did. I actually did it. About 2 years ago is when I switched my main desktop PC from Windows to Linux for my primary OS. The way I did it, and the way I recommend most people do it, is setting up a dual boot, and there's a couple ways to do that. So one is resizing your Windows partition and installing Linux onto the remaining space, which is definitely doable. I know it sounds scary to most people, but you can do it. Another option, and this is the one I went with, is just getting another SSD. You can just buy another SSD, install Linux onto that, and you can set it up to boot either into Linux by default or Windows by default using Grub, which is a popular boot manager. And this method will allow you to try Linux on your main full system, just like you would expect it to work in exactly the same way as if you're using it as your main OS, with no loss of performance. And crucially, your Windows partition remains fully intact. So at any moment, if you change your mind, you can just wipe the SSD, uninstall it, be right back into Windows, and just use the extra SSD space for games or files. The reason I recommend you do this is because when you're first learning Linux, you might feel at times uncomfortable. You might just want to just say, screw this whole thing. I want to go back to my comfy Windows where I feel at home. And then you can use Windows for a while, but then if you want to come back to Linux, if you're like, no, this is a change I want to make, you can go back to Linux. It kind of gives you time to learn. Now, a lot of people that talk about Linux, they're Linux fanboys. They're obsessed with free and open source software. It's like this cult, and it seems like a lot of people are under the impression that Linux is destined to be the main PC desktop operating system, and that eventually there will come a time where Linux has a majority market share, and most average people, are going to be using Linux as the daily driver operating system. I'm not under that delusion, and I understand that a lot of people just don't want to learn something else. Windows, for better or worse, has been a monopoly for a very long time now. It's had a huge market share for all that time. People just know how to use it. And you're not going to convince the average person to learn a system that, to certain extents, depending on what desktop environment you go with, could be pretty similar to Windows, like KDE Plasma, or could be completely different, like GNOME, which is a common Linux desktop environment that I personally don't like because it's so different from Windows. But if you're willing to put in a little bit of effort, and especially if your motivation is stopping Microsoft and perhaps associated government entities from spying on you and everything you do on your computer at all times, or if you simply just want to be more in control of what runs on your computer, the Microsoft Defender, the OneDrive pop-up that you can't disable, all these different things that you could disable if you really wanted to, but it's kind of just a hassle that you shouldn't have to do, right? If you want complete transparency and control of what's running on your computer, if you want privacy, I'd really recommend that you take this lead. So I'm going to tell you exactly what I recommend, depending on what works for you. One of the nice things about Linux is that it's not a one-size-fits-all option. It's pretty much the opposite. Whatever your inclination is, whether it's something totally customizable, or if you just want something that works out of the box, or maybe something in between, you have unlimited options. There's really something for everyone. Windows 11, it's Windows, and there's different versions like Home or Pro or Education, but it's pretty much the same thing. Linux, on the other hand, is an umbrella term for all these operating systems that fall under it. It's really a collection of tools. So let's imagine Windows is a pre-built playset for kids from Costco. What you get is what you get. Maybe you can get one that's a different color. Maybe you can get one with a swing or one without a swing. Linux is more like a Home Depot. Linux is a collection of individual tools. It's entirely possible to build a Linux operating system entirely from scratch. It's not typically recommended, especially not for newcomers. But if you want to install something that works in the same way as Windows out of the box, you're typically going to be installing what's called a distribution or distro. And what that is basically an entity, whether a company or a group of individuals, get together and they bundle a bunch of software all together so you can install it as a Linux distro onto a USB drive, boot from it, then install it onto your SSD, and you're good to go. And if that sounds scary, don't worry, because you're going to find a lot of different communities, each with vast resources on how to do various things or solve various problems. When you Google Linux, you're going to find forums online for Linux Mint. You're going to find forums for Ubuntu. You're going to find forums for Arch Linux. There's a bunch of different resources out there and different methods that you can use to solve certain problems. But keep in mind that solutions that work on one distro are not necessarily going to work on another. And that's because they're using different package managers or maybe even different init systems. And there's a laundry list of things that can be different from one distro to another. Ubuntu is commonly referred to as a sort of a noob distro, but it also has a reputation for ease of use. So if you just want stability, something that works out of the box, has great support, stability, etc., just install Ubuntu, learn how to use it, and you're off to the races. You won't have to think about it ever again. You're done with Microsoft just like that. Now, personally, I don't find Ubuntu quite as easy to use for something that's coming from Windows as another distribution called Kubuntu. And the main difference between Ubuntu and Kubuntu is actually based off of Ubuntu, by the way. Ubuntu uses a desktop environment called GNOME, and Kubuntu comes with a desktop environment called KDE Plasma. And I'm personally a huge fan of KDE Plasma, and I use it as my main desktop environment. So if you want something that looks and feels a lot like Windows, but is still customizable, you're going to want to go with Kubuntu. So that's pretty much the gist of it between those two, just sort of easy to start with distros. Now, Arch Linux is the polar opposite of those two. Its reputation precedes itself in meme circles on the internet. Arch Linux is about as minimal of an install as you can get out of a Linux distribution. It doesn't come with built-in programs like photo viewers or even file browsers. It doesn't even come with a desktop environment. When you first boot into Arch Linux, it's just a command prompt, like an old DOS PC from the 90s with the black screen and the white text. It's not generally recommended for someone that's new to Linux, but you can still use Arch if you are new, if you're willing to follow some guides and learn. And again, the main pro of Arch Linux is that it's almost entirely from scratch, or as from scratch as a distribution can really be, while still being doable by the average person. I also really like what's called the package manager that comes with Arch Linux. I personally think it's fantastic. Package manager, by the way, is the program that facilitates installing and updating virtually all the software that you'll install, which includes drivers, applications, libraries, almost everything. So Pacman is the package manager on Arch Linux. It's fast, it's easy to use, it works really well. And I also personally, this is just an Arch benefit, I like knowing that everything that is on my computer is something that I manually installed. So all the code that's running on my PC is something that I had to type the commands manually to install. The next topic is gaming. A huge question for a lot of people considering switching from Windows to Linux is, how do I get my games to run? Once upon a time, that would have been a huge hassle, but nowadays it's actually a lot easier than you might think. So first off, during your installation of Linux, the distro itself will install the appropriate graphics drivers for your system, whether it's NVIDIA, AMD, Intel Arc, or in the case of Arch, you'll install the drivers manually. But all the GPU vendors have really good Linux drivers at this point. A few games run even better on Linux than they do on modern Windows systems, which is surprising for a lot of people to hear. But compatibility has come a super long way in the last 5 to 10 years in terms of running Windows games on Linux. And that's primarily thanks to the work that Valve, which is the company that is in charge of Steam, has done. They created a comprehensive compatibility layer called Proton, and Proton allows you to run almost any Windows game right out of the box. You just download a game off of Steam, you hit play, and it just runs. You don't have to think about it. There's not going to be any fussing around with command prompts and stuff like that. There are a few games, especially niche or older games, where you might have to put in a little more work. But even for those, there's another application called Lutris. And if you're installing one of those games, there are often setup profiles that make it really pretty easy. And on top of that, there are community guides for a ton of things related to gaming. The average person is not going to be switching to Linux for the fun of it. But this video is aimed at someone who wants to switch for a reason, right? Maybe you want to know more about computers and how they work, or you want to get more familiar with something a little different. You want computers to be fun, maybe even a little challenging if you like that kind of thing. If you're at all technically savvy, I promise you can definitely figure it out. The only real downside to switching to Linux is application support at this point. The main apps that people might miss, if you care about these, is going to be the Adobe Suite, which I personally hate and don't use on the grounds that I don't like the company. So that'd be Photoshop, Premiere Pro, apps like that. And also, notably, a lot of popular competitive games. These might be deal breaker for you, at least to fully delete your Windows dual boot. I'll list the highlights. Those would be Escape from Tarkov, PUBG, Fortnite, Valorant, Warzone, Apex Legends, Rainbow Six Siege, and Destiny 2. Unfortunately, there are still a few games where even while compatibility-wise, they would run perfectly fine under Proton. They use what's called kernel-level anti-cheat software, which is basically anti-cheat software that runs with the highest level of privilege on your system, and it only works with Windows. It's honestly kind of an issue when it comes to security, but Microsoft seems to not care about that much at this point. And to be clear, this is totally a decision by the game developers. It's not that the game doesn't work on Linux, it's that the game developers won't allow it to work on Linux. Regardless, as the case may be game to game, if you're considering switching to Linux and there's a game you absolutely can't live without, I honestly can't recommend dual booting, switching into Windows just to play that one game and then booting back into Linux for everything else, unless you hate Microsoft as much as I do. But if it's a game that you don't play very often and you're willing to do that, that's one thing, but that's likely going to be the crux of your decision. Are there apps and or games that I absolutely need that will not run on Linux? If you're interested to learn more about any of these distributions I've mentioned, I'm going to leave some links and community resources in the video description. Other than that, please just Google stuff. There are so many resources out there for anyone. If you want to know, there's going to be tons of information out there for you. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and if you decide to take the leap, I wish you the best of luck on your journey. Take care.